So in the previous sort of tutorial, we were looking at the user interface. I decided to stop that there because I didn't want it to turn into some huge, great long video, but we're going to continue here. So we got to basically the brush editing tools here in the previous video. So what we're going to look at now is the play button. Now the play button is basically, if we press that, that allows us to then essentially play our game. As you can see here, the guy's running around doing what he's got to do. Hit escape to get out of that. If you click the three dots next to it, you've got different types here. So you can have it pop out in a window. You can have things like, if you're creating a multiplayer game, there's sort of a number of players you can have in it, things like that. Simulate, basically, that takes it out as if it's a packaged game, from what I understand. So it's good practice to look at that if you're building huge scenes, to get an idea of how it's actually performing. Because when you're actually running the say the game in the viewport or a standalone, you're still using the overheads of Unreal Engine. When you're using Simulate, it stops using a lot of the resources in Unreal Engine. So we're just going to generally stick to play, to be honest. Platforms, we're not going to be looking at this because we're just going to be working on our desktop here. This is, I believe, allows you to sort of package content into what platform you want it to go out on and things like that. But again, we're just going to be not looking in that. So now over here, we've got the world outliner. So if I drag this down just for the minute, this basically contains all of the elements of our scene. So if we click on the floor, I'll click on here because it was already on the floor. You can see here that it's found this here. We can turn that off, hide it. We can create folders, all sorts, to keep things tidy. So this is just essentially like a list of all of our assets in the scene and our sort of things like our lighting and things like that. This is very important because as you go along, you'll be in and out of here and whatnot. Using it. You can obviously resize that by dragging it up here. The next part is the details panel. You'll be using this a lot. This contains details related to whatever you're clicked on. So in this case, we're clicked on this light here, and you can see here you've got things like light color. So we change that. You can see here. Things like the light position. So as if we hit E, as I move that, you can see this value here is changing. What I'll do is I'll do something that's a bit more drastic. So you can see there the value is changing. You've got obviously loads of different settings down here, depending on what you're using. So if we click on this cube, you get something different. Obviously, we don't have all the lighting settings, things like that. It's what meshes it using, things like that. This is very important. It's one of those things that it's sort of, for me to go through explaining every single thing in this, to be honest, would be a bit pointless because there's certain elements of it that, you know, you may never touch, but someone else in your team might touch, things like that. So there's, you know, it's, if you want to go through this, there's plenty of documentation on what everything does here. Then if we hold Control and press Spacebar, we've got the content browser. So that is similar to this that we opened earlier, but it's kept nice and neatly down here. So if you again Control Space, this brings up this content browser, and this is where all of our assets are kept. So if we go to third person here, you've got the stairs, things like that. You can create folders, you can create all sorts here. You can set the size of the thumbnail. So obviously for this video, it's a bit too big. So that's probably about the right size. So we will be using this a lot to obviously to get assets from, put assets in, textures, things like that. I'll show you the sort of structure that the Unreal Engine Marketplace uses, because I assume that that's the practice that they want to use, but we'll be looking at that in a later video. Right, if you right click in that, you've got all these options here. Some of these options will be using things like material, creating blueprint classes, things like that. Again, we'll be looking at that later on in the video, so I won't go too in depth with that. And so you can see there, as soon as we click back in the scene, it disappears. So click back in the scene, disappears. So the final few things is probably this little section here. You can do things like show your frame rate. So you can see here it's maxing out 120 frames. So this allows you to see that if you're dropping, say, 20,000 trees in a scene, how much of an impact has that had on your scene? And it also helps you to sort of look at, you know, well, I need to work on this area because it's dropped 30 frames a second and this area is 60 frames a second, things like that. You've got loads of different things here, things like your field of view. Generally, the only thing I use in this little drop down here is the FPS. The next one is the perspective. We'll get there in a minute, which is the sort of how your viewport views. We're currently in perspective mode, and if we switch this to top, that allows us to see it from the top. So it might be that you want to lay out a scene, and you know you've laid out this section, you want to copy and paste it over here and lay it out the same, and you can easily get that. You can switch this being to like a lit mode there. We'll come to that in a second. So again, same principle. If you move down, get all these different views. Generally, I stay in perspective. I need to stop saying that. So the next one is lit. So sometimes you might be working on a really complicated scene and it's really hitting your computer because you haven't built the lighting, things like that. What you can do is turn the lighting off. Sometimes I do this just to make working a lot more easier. Before optimization, things like that. So when you click on this, you drop down, you get unlit mode. And you can also got things like your wireframe mode, so you can see how many polygons are perhaps in an object. So we look at the man here; he's got loads more polygons, things like that. You've got all these sort of different settings. The ones that I generally use are lit, unlit, and because they're just, I find the most useful. You've also got things like that we'll be looking at is that under optimization views is light map density. This is very important. This again we'll be looking at. Just a quick rundown. This basically shows you how much time it will take when building your lighting. So if something's red, it will take longer than something that is blue, and then green is almost like the Goldilocks syndrome where it's just right. But again, we'll look at how to do that. So again, drop that down. Show. These allow you to turn off things like, if you have fog, and so you then turn off, say, for instance, the static meshes in the scene. So if you wanted to get rid of everything in the scene, apart from, say, the lighting to look at it, you've got all these options here. Generally, I haven't had the need to go into any of this. So I think that's pretty much it. Probably one of the other areas to look at is if we click here, project settings, and sometimes you'll need to be coming in and out of here, like the rendering, for instance. If we click on the rendering tab here, you've got loads of settings, things like if you want to turn off motion blur, you can see here, it looks a bit overwhelming, but things like you can turn off bloom, so when the lights say something's an emissive texture and it adds sort of that sort of hazy edging to it. Things like that. You can disable, enable ambient occlusion, auto exposure, things like that. There's motion blur. There's tons of stuff in here. Like if you're creating a game, you'd be looking at things like input. So this is here is like move forward. So when W key is, so there we go, when W key is pressed, that moves forward. So that then allows us to call that within the script in blueprints to allow us our character to move forward. But again, we'll probably be only looking in the rendering section to turn on things like the lumen lighting, which is already on, but sort of maybe increase quality and things like that. But yeah, hopefully this helped. If it has, please do like and subscribe, and we'll move on to the next part.